recent events in the nation's capital, the events of last summer, showed a mentality that exists in the world that is not good. And the idea that says might makes right. When defined by the world's principles, throws us all into chaos and accomplishes no good. We're privileged to live in America. And one of the things about America is that we value our freedoms, we value our self-sufficiency, we value the rights and privileges that we all have, none of which are we opposed to as Christians. We expect those, we want those things. We teach our children to take care of yourselves, to be prepared to handle what comes your way. We want our children to grow up to be strong and independent. And all of those things, as a Christian, we don't necessarily oppose in every detail, but of course we put all of that in the context of understanding God and appreciating all that that means. This morning, quickly notice that when the world says might makes right, it comes not from a good place, and it puts us in a bad place. Turn, if you will, to 2 Corinthians, the text that was just read for us. And this will be our text for the day. And I want you to notice three things today as we see the text. I want you to notice what the world means when they say, might makes right. I want you to notice what Paul meant when he said, might makes right. And I want you to notice what God intends when he says, might makes right. Let's notice first what the world says, what the world means. Now, in this text that was read for us, there are a number of things that jump out that the world says or views in a totally different way. The first is these. When they say might makes right, they mean I demand myself to be strong enough to take care of myself. I'm not talking about maturity. I'm talking about the demand of self to say, whatever you have to do to come out on top, that's what you need to do. I want to be strong enough to take care of myself. But God said, my grace is sufficient for you. The world says, my strength becomes imperfect if ever there is any weakness in my life. I'm not going to show weakness because I want to be strong. But God said, my strength is made perfect in weakness. The world says might makes right, and I am too ashamed to give you the impression in any way that I am weak. You do me a disservice if you think I'm weak, you think I can't handle this. But through Paul, God said, therefore, most gladly, I will boast in my infirmities. The world says, might makes right, and I don't want to put up with anything that is a problem. I don't want to be in a problem. I think people who are problems need to be eliminated. I don't want to have any trouble. I don't want to have any difficulties. I want everything to be just the way I want it. And might makes right. I'll get it done. But through Paul, God could say, I can take pleasure in reproach and distress and infirmity. Finally, when the world says right or might makes right, they say, when I am weak, I am defeated. And I have to beat you. And I have to win. And it has to turn out the way I want it. And if not, I'm going to show you my strength in your face. The world's view that might makes right creates a world that not one of us would want to live in. Do you like being around people who are bullies? Did you ever have a bully in your life, ever? I had a guy one time in the 9th grade, and they played on the football team, and every day he would come by and just poke me in the chest and make his point. Every day. I don't remember how long. I just remember it was constant. You want to live like that all the time? Do you want to live in a country where people are constantly poking you in the chest? Do you think the church would work like that? I mean, what if every time we met, the shepherds just went around and poked you in the chest and said, you're going to do what we tell you to do? You don't want to live that way. And yet when the world says, might makes right, that's exactly what they're saying. So what did Paul mean? The words that Paul used give me a whole different impression of what it means that might makes right. Paul said, first, I want to be strong enough to let God be my strength in my weakness. It's a whole lot easier many times to lash out. But Paul said, I want to be strong enough to let God be my strength. Paul meant when he said, might makes right. Paul meant, look, he said, this is what makes me strong. God's strength gives me strength. It doesn't lie within me. It doesn't depend upon me primarily. Paul was able to say, it's in God. Therefore, I'm not ashamed to show you that I'm weak. I'm not ashamed to say, I can't do this on my own. I need you. I need God. I need Jesus in my life. If you think that makes me weak, Paul said, so be it. But I'm not ashamed to be weak in the presence of the Lord. In fact, I'm going to boast about it. I'm willing to tell every single person, yes, I have problems, I have infirmities, I have persecutions, I have distresses. Things aren't going exactly the way I want them to go. I'm not going to hide from it. There's no need to put on a front when every single one of us is going through our own difficulties, our own problems, our own distresses. And Paul said, I don't mind telling you that. I don't mind being weak. Because finally, when I am weak, then I'm strong. Paul was actually saying, my weakness is my strength. Sounds odd, doesn't it? When you are asked to show your strength, you ask a little child, how strong are you? Let me see your muscles. And they do this every time, don't they? And they strain. But when you ask a Christian, let me see your strength. Paul says that we should be able to bow our heads and admit that there are difficulties in our lives. And we're fighting every day. But we rely on God and on our brethren to pick us up. It's not too weak to say, I have missed this. If you can say, I'm just as satisfied being out there in that other world of worship online, I think that's sad. You need to be weak enough to admit that we need each other, and certainly that we need God. But I'm here to tell you today that might does make right. When you use God's definition, it works. So what does God mean? Number one, He means my strength, my might makes you strong enough to be right. God told His people through the pen of Moses in Exodus 23:2, You shall not follow a multitude to do evil. Be right. Sure, that fits in the secular world. Don't go off into the crowd that's sinning. Don't just go along with the cultural norm just because the group is pressuring it. But this attitude works as it relates to God Himself and your relationship. The Bible teaches what is right. And just because there are people or there are churches or there are places that teach something that's not right, God said, be strong enough with my might to be right. Because might does make right. Number two, God says, my might makes you not need to demand your rights. What rights do we really have? What rights do we really have? Let's use God's illustration. Here's a bowl made out of pottery. Back when baby pottery was the big deal, right? I never got to go, but I know people who stood in line for that very purpose. What would you think about baby pottery? They made all these bowls, and all of a sudden they walked in and said, sorry, to the people standing in line. And they took every one of those bowls and crashed them on the floor. Would anybody say, wait a minute, you don't have the right to do that? And they would say, oh, yes, we do. We own the pottery. God said, I am the potter. You are the clay. Before God, what rights do we have? We have the right to be right with God. And God says, you don't have to demand your rights. Because He says, submit to one another in the fear of the Lord, Ephesians 5:21. Number three, God says might does make right. My might will make you expect people to be right. I expect people to do what's right, don't you? I went to my car this morning to come here. Somebody had been in it. And they opened my glove compartment, pulled everything out, filtered through the whole car. Of course, had you looked in the car, you wouldn't have been able to tell if it was a mess or not because, you know, it looks like somebody's been in my car all the time. But I could tell. They didn't really take anything. But I expect people to be right. I don't expect people to walk through the neighborhood and just every now and then get in people's cars and start looking through stuff. Do you? That's why Paul said to Timothy, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, encourage with all long-suffering and teaching, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but because of their own itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers. I expect people to be right. God expects people to be right. He expects us to teach them to be right because might, His might, makes right. Number 4, God means. Might makes right. My might will help you know when something's not right. Awake to righteousness, Paul said to the Corinthians, and do not sin, for some do not have the mind of Christ. With God's might, you can see through the fog. You can see through the deception. You can see through the distortion and find what is really right. You can see it when it's not right. And that's how God's might makes right. Finally, when God says might makes right, He says this: my might will help you make things right. Proverbs 2 and verse 9. To the one who has wisdom, the strength that comes from God, Solomon was talking to his son Rehoboam, and he said, then you'll understand righteousness and justice and equity and every good path. So how do we make things right when they are not? It's certainly not by the might of the world, but it is by the might of God's strength that calls people to righteousness, to equity, to justice, and to every good path. So when I hear people say, might makes right, I want to know, what do you mean? Because if you mean it the way God does, I am on your side. I'll stand with you shoulder to shoulder. But if you mean it in the way that a lot of people in the world do, I will run from you. I will oppose you. I will preach against you. I'll pray for you. And I will pray for those situations where might gets out of control. Let us be a people who find our strength in God. And in finding that strength to be right. And so tonight, we will notice that being right makes might. If you're not right with God today, Jesus died to make it right. You can be immersed into Jesus Christ. You can repent of sins. You can let these people pray for you. We help in any way that we can online if you want to contact us and let us pray for you and offer any suggestions and advice. We're here because we believe that God's might makes right. And if we can help you today, if you are here, our shepherds will meet you at the front. Let's stand and sing together.